Okay, good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for joining the webinar. Particularly grateful to our lineup of speakers for joining, who've got many insights to share that I keep finding every time we start talking on these things, even before we get going, I start learning things. But I guess by way of context for some who didn't join us in the previous webinar, we had lots of discussion around, really sparked by what are we seeing in drug discovery and the R&D space in terms of high levels of redundancy, investment not coming into early stages and going later, and all the challenges with that. And it raised a whole load of questions that we weren't going to find solutions to on one call. Um, but equally, what it did do was really highlight the urgency and the need to do something active and proactive to see how we can help get ourselves out of this situation, as well as what do we need government to do to help and incentivize. I mean, there's many other commentaries appearing almost daily around this. Probably most recently on my radar was Kate Bingham's article and presentation she gave at an event last night, around the need to get market access and patients into trials, and really move from just discovering drugs to developing them and adopting them and getting more cash into the system, I guess, and whether that helps us to scale. But I guess on the flip side of that is, if there is more cash to come in and where the squeeze points are, one of the points that came up last time was whether if we fixed more of the clinical development and clinical research and speed and access to doing that with the NHS for companies, that would encourage and incentivize more early discovery to stay here. Or in fact, we need to focus on the early discovery bit to make sure there's a pipeline of things to put through the NHS and use that capacity and leverage it. And I think that really come back round to then just how complicated the funding landscape was as to who was funding what. There's all sorts of reports and anecdotes out there. But I'm delighted today, therefore, on the webinar, and we'll have plenty of time for Q&A as well, hopefully, and people do feel free to put things into the chat box, and I'll pick up as I can. But to have David Montgomery, Matthew Fife, and Shuli Porkes talking about those things, about who's funding what's the case for funding early discovery and why it's essential, and then what would be the benefits that feed back through that if we start addressing the clinical development challenges and hurdles. So I guess that's probably enough from me as Tony Jones of One Nucleus hosting the webinar. I'm delighted to be giving a platform to this sort of discussion, but I'm then going to hand over to David Montgomery, who will set out some of those complexities about where the funding is or isn't coming from and what levers are driving that. So David, over to you.
Tony, thank you very much. I'm actually going to do something more controversial than that. Let me get my slides up and ask a slightly more fundamental question, perhaps. And I will talk a little bit about funding. So much more importantly, and this has come up, there's a real question about whether Britain is actually able to implement an industrial strategy, and if so, how would it go about it? So here is the life sciences sector plan. This is essentially what the industrial strategy states are the levers and objectives for the life sciences as part of our industrial strategy. So the ambition is to produce a health data research service that generates revenue and is self-funding by 2035. And we're putting £600 million into that, a relatively small amount of money. There are a number of targets in the O'Shaughnessy review of clinical trials. We'll probably come to a little bit of that later, but specifically slashing trial setup times is mentioned in the sector plan. Attracting globally mobile manufacturing by backing manufacturing £520 million, again, a relatively small amount. And there's a whole bunch of other stuff in there. So, I mean, I think what I'm struck by when I read the life sciences sector plan is that it's very broad. We're really trying to tackle pretty much all the stuff that you possibly could. We're not going after phase 1 studies in the way that Australia is, or going after phase 3 studies in the way that countries like Spain and Poland and others are. We're kind of backing absolutely everything here. And then we've got some no, we don't. We've got some very high level ambitions, which are quite some way into the future. without any roadmap for that. But on the background of this, UK policy has been essentially non-interventionist since Thatcher was introduced. We've run a laissez-faire capitalist economy all the way through. Prime ministers have attempted to introduce industrial strategies. Famously, Theresa May was the first Conservative Prime Minister to do so, and it lasted about until Boris Johnson came in and was then scrapped for a much more, again, sort of laissez-faire approach. And what I find really interesting in amongst all of that is political stability. So the last time a Prime Minister won a majority in this country and led their party into the next election was 2001 with Tony Blair. I don't think any of us would bet that Keir Starmer is going to do that. And what that essentially means is that it can't happen until the election afterwards. So we will go a third of a century where a prime minister doesn't stay in office after winning an election till the next election. And that's a level of political turbulence that makes it very difficult. Someone said to me in the background of all of that, government tenure plans are unusual. They occur no more frequently than 2 or 3 times a decade. And so again, you've got this challenge of constant shift in priorities. So I would say the industrial strategy fails when no one owns the delivery. For a life science strategy to work, you need a named steward. Oops, what have I just done? I've just made it all big again, sorry. You need the named steward, you need a visible scorecard, you need disciplined prioritization, you need mechanisms to redirect money when the pipeline is failing. So I think there are a number of minimum governance requirements, one accountable system owner, clear annual objectives, explicit choices on priorities, trade-offs, and what won't be funded, mechanisms to move capital towards bottlenecks when the evidence changes and when it becomes clear what's failing. And this matters for all of these reasons. So that then led me to the question, if we need to be able to redirect money when the pipeline fails, or we need to be able to work out where we target our spending to move along bottlenecks, do we actually know what we're spending? And the answer to that really is, at a system level, no. There have been a huge number of funding reports, but they all address a bit of the system. So you've got the UK biotech financing from BIA, which talks about what gets put into biotech. British Business Bank evaluates its own investment programme. You've got a government life sciences sector plan, which is high level. You've got UKRI. You've got Tony Hickson's report, which we'll come to again. You've got the UK Health Research Analysis is probably the biggest single source on overlap in clinical research, but it doesn't include early stage research or discovery research. So essentially, you know, as you go through this, what you recognize is that there are huge numbers of organizations and institutions putting money into the system, but no one has mapped it comprehensively. And so when UKRI decides that it's going to bolster a certain sector, it's going to increase discovery spending, or it's going to increase spending to help upscale small businesses or whatever, the other sectors scream and say, no, you can't reduce our funding, we'll all die. But of course, we don't really know, because in truth, we don't know who else is funding those sectors. We don't have a clear enough picture to be able to work out who's telling the truth and who isn't, what's overfunded and what's underfunded. And with this very short-term change in ownership of ministerial briefs, another interesting statistic, with the introduction of a new health secretary and a new Secretary of State for Innovation within the Department of Health, we now have our 47th minister in the Department of Health in 10 years, 47 different ministers in a decade. And as a consequence of that, these people just don't have the time to get their head around the complexities because we haven't mapped it. There are a number of really good graphics. I showed these at the last webinar, which shows where we've got challenges in funding. These have come from government sources. They came from Tony Hickson's really, really good publication recently on funding university spinouts. And what's really, really clear, we talk a little bit about the various organizations, incubators, angel investors, venture capital, banks and capital markets. He talks a little bit about the UK organisations and where they fund, so Innovate UK, British Business Bank, the National Wealth Fund, UK Export Finance, all that stuff. But he continues to point to these two very well described gaps, this early commercialisation gap, seed, pre-seed, and this sort of capital intense scaling commercialisation gap where it's very, very difficult to find the money. But I guess the question then is, where does this money come from if these organizations and entities aren't enough, and can we redistribute from somewhere else because we know there isn't any more money. I'll talk a little bit about geography. We could talk about that as well. When you start looking at capital spend, you can see once again there's a huge amount of money in the southeast of England and not much else. So this is well mapped. But there is a really big question about what we do about it. We were in Wales recently, and the Welsh have really struggled since Brexit to replace quite a lot of European Union funding, and really struggled to work out how they tap into the capital markets that exist in England that England has been taking advantage of for a while. So the same is true in Northern Ireland. So what do I think? I think the UK has a centralised ambition in its life sciences sector plan, but it's got profoundly decentralised execution with public money, NHS research infrastructure, targeted industrial funds, investment programme, charity funding, all sit in separate charities with different objectives and different accountabilities. And that makes it hard to know whether total spending is actually strategically coherent, where overlap exists between government and charities, and who's responsible when the pipeline weakens. How do we deploy capital at scale to help fix those problems? And the question isn't only whether more money is needed, but whether anyone can see the whole architecture well enough to choose what each pound is for, and to stop pretending all spending is equally strategic. So very quickly, I'll conclude, then I'll hand over. Funding volume is not the same as funding strategy. If no one owns the whole pipeline, gaps and duplication are predictable, not surprising. And a serious industrial strategy, if government's really going to fix this, it requires system stewardship, not just more pots and better slogans. And so we can have a conversation, I guess, about whether we really think the government's going to fix it, or whether we as an industry have to find ways of coming together to do that ourselves.
Thanks, David. I think that fundamental question, like I say, it's are we capable, and if UK is capable, then where does the right leadership and strategy come from? I guess moving on from that perspective of that fundamental question, then I'm happy to welcome Matthew Fife to the screen. Really about, again, looking at the drug discovery element of this. And I kind of liked your title there about, it matters. And it matters for a whole range of reasons, which we talked about last time and we'll come on to. But Matthew, over to you. How do we decide where the choices are of where to put money?
Thanks very much, Tony. So yes, so as David pointed out, it is very spread out, our life sciences system. So I've been tasked to talk about defending the drug discovery sector. And as you know, as everyone's aware, I'm sure that there have been considerable redundancies in the past 3 years as a result of the biotech funding crunch. And these have been documented by Natasha Robbins and discussed in the last webinar. But my thesis today is that if we do stop funding discovery, which is difficult to get money in at this moment in time, my suggestion is that we'll eventually lose everything. We'll lose all the development and all the other downstream activities to the manufacturing, etc. My belief is that we cannot be a global biotech development hub, which is what the government wants as part of its industrial strategy. If that part of the system that actually makes the drugs in the first place, that designs and creates the new medicines in the first place, is hollowed out, and if we don't achieve the objectives of the government's industrial strategy, then I don't think the country's going to achieve growth. Discovery science is part of that growth, leading to development. We have a fantastic track record of discovering blockbuster drugs in this country. The cumulative global sales of all the drugs discovered in the United Kingdom is over $300 billion. So it's absolutely massive. And this goes all the way historically from penicillin through beta blockers from James Black to Humira, which was discovered at Cambridge Antibody Technology. This is the biggest selling drug of all time by Cambridge Antibody Technologies. Viagra from Pfizer, etc., etc. It's just the UK drug discovery fingerprints are all over medicines that have made huge amount of money. Even the current biggest seller today, Keytruda, that was humanized as part of the LMB's, the MRC LMB's humanization program for antibodies. So we've really got a track record of delivering money from creative drugs in this country. And this builds upon the defining contributions that this country has made to medical science. So I've just rattled off a few. I could go on for ages here, but obviously the DNA double helix was the structure was first seen in this country. Monoclonal antibodies were discovered by the hybridoma technology by Cesar Milstein's lab in the mid-1970s. And then more recently, we've got things like the Oxford AstraZeneca COVID vaccine, and AlphaFold, which won the Nobel Prize in Chemistry only a couple of years ago. So we have punched above our weight in terms of discovering blockbuster drugs and making pivotal contributions to medical science. And this is largely a result of us having 4 of the world's top 10 universities for life sciences and medicine that are in the UK. And this forms part of it. These universities form a part of a very integrated ecosystem which has everything. Maybe it's too broad, as David pointed out previously, but we've got everything going all the way through from chemistry and structural biology and genomics work, all the way through to translational research and the NHS delivering medicines to patients. This integrated ecosystem in discovery, there's really dense concentrations of scientific excellence. So these are around our world-class universities. These are formed around our world-class universities. And these universities interface not just with large pharma, but we've also got medical charities and institutes, Wellcome Foundation, etc. And really, the life sciences sector is not separate from our world-class universities. It's really an extension of them. And my worry is that if we take out the discovery bridge from the life sciences to development and ultimately to the NHS, we'll break the bond and we'll lose everything. So why does discovery science matter economically to the UK? One of the first issues that I'm going to bring up is related to something that I learned from I did the Boston boot camp from One Nucleus. I went on the first Boston boot camp, and talking to the people from Massachusetts government, they had a very well-defined strategy to bring in biotech and pharma jobs. They attracted pharma and biotech companies to Massachusetts. They brought in very well-paid jobs. This brought in tax revenues to Massachusetts that allowed them to improve the infrastructure, the discovery and development infrastructure. This brought in more well-paid jobs, which brought in more tax revenues, and it was just a virtuous cycle. And I think the government is quite short-sighted when it looks at skimping on paying for medicines, because that leads ultimately to a desire of the innovative pharmaceutical companies. They lose the desire to input money into this country and create jobs that will bring tax revenues. As pointed out in the last slide, discovery research really bridges our academic world-class excellence with industrial value creation. There are pharmaceutical companies, AstraZeneca, GlaxoSmithKline. My worry is that if we weaken that bridge any further, university science will become economically extractive for other countries. It already is economically extractive. A lot of our discoveries are being monetized in the United States. A prime example is the recent purchase of Metsera by Pfizer for 10 billion. This was available for peanuts out of Imperial College Science from Professor Steve Bloom's laboratory, and it's now being monetized. Metsera sold for 10 billion when they had bought it previously for about 200 million. My thesis is that development employment is not independent of discovery employment. It's downstream of it. And one discovery program creates demand across the whole plethora of the value chain. So it's toxicology, CMC activities, clinical operations, regulatory, manufacturing, etc., etc. And if we only optimize for downstream development risk, I do worry that we'll just become a service economy for innovation that is generated in other countries. So these are some of the things that I'm really worried about that keep me up at night with when I see the number of redundancies that have been in the past 3 years, which Natasha Robbins has highlighted. Rebuilding this ecosystem will take a long time to get it back again. We've built up all this knowledge, all these skills over years and years and years, and it's going to take a long time to build it up again. So I'm worried about talent migrating permanently, not just from the country as a whole, not just from the United Kingdom, but also into other sectors. I think this will also lead to fewer scientists being trained in core drug discovery disciplines. This will lead to universities offering less drug discovery, life sciences courses, which will bring in less revenue for them, and our expertise will disappear, and startups will form in other countries. The value of IP will be realized by other countries, and investors will see less opportunities in the United Kingdom. If we've lost the expertise and the infrastructure, then they'll invest into other clusters. And then finally, biotech companies in the sector I work in are being pushed to focus prematurely. We're losing value. Assets are being lost. Last company, Storm Therapeutics, we had numerous assets which are being lost, with only the main asset being developed in the United States, the main clinical asset being developed. And there are plenty of very other valuable assets that have been lost because of our premature focus. So strategic questions I believe we need to ask as employees in the UK drug discovery sector is we need to really say to the government that maintaining our innovation sovereignty and keeping that value all the way through from discovery right the way through to commercialization relies on sustaining our world-class discovery ecosystems. And the question for the government is, can the UK retain the capability it has to convert innovative scientific insight from universities through discovery and into development and into companies that make money for the country and bring revenues to the United Kingdom. And for this, the UK needs patient capital. We need money to come into the sector for preclinical innovation. There is the Mansion House Compact. There are some funds that are starting to trickle in, but it needs to be more. We need more money coming into the discovery engine, or there will be no new drugs coming from this country. We will lose our expertise and competitiveness in the discovery sector. And I do fear that the goals of the government in their life sciences sector plan will fall short. So those are, as David pointed out, to be #1 in Europe by 2030 and number 3 globally by 2035. I actually asked, I went to Kate Bingham's lecture last night at the Royal Society of Medicine. I actually asked her that question: are our objectives ambitious enough to be number 1 in Europe? Are we, aren't we already there? To be number 3 globally, aren't we already there behind US and China? And her answer is no. We've got countries that are already overtaking us, at least in the development space, such as Australia, such as Spain, as highlighted by David. And that'll just continue in the discovery arena if we don't fund it in the near future. So my closing thought is that, yes, we cannot outspend the US or China in life sciences, but we do want to at least be number 3 in the world, I think. And the country can remain one of the few places where we have everything. We've got world-class university science and discovery science, dovetailing with medicine in a single ecosystem. This is something very unique that the UK has, and they're very concentrated. We're very close together in such a small country. We've got everything together in a single ecosystem. It's much more fragmented, for example, in the United States. And my contention that this ecosystem is worth protecting. So this is, as a group of people working in life sciences, drug discovery, drug development, we need to discuss with people such as Tony Jones is One Nucleus, with organizations such as the Bioindustry Association, the BIA, how we can influence government in order to keep our expertise within this country and keep on discovering blockbuster drugs using world-class science. So that's me, Tony. That's me finished my...
Thanks, Matthew. I think an impassioned and convincing argument for drug discovery there, and the nature of the ecosystem we have. And I think moving that again, it comes down to these choices of what we can fix first and when, and who can fix them, perhaps, and we come on to the discussion. But now I'd like to ask Julie Porkis to come on to screen to look at why it's important to think about that clinical development side beyond discovery, and why that matters if we want to get this ecosystem to work. Julie.
Great, thank you. Can you see my screen okay?
Yep.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you, and thank you for inviting me to talk. So I'm Julie Porkis, co-founder of PM Life Sciences, along with David, and I hold a number of other roles, including trustee roles alongside that. I'm a medic by background, spent many years in pharma, but also was the director of research through Brexit and through COVID. And I mentioned that because in that role, I was working on clinical research policy in terms of, how do we understand what's going on in terms of clinical research in the UK? And then how did we work through it with Brexit and COVID? And I think, my reflections over the next kind of 3 or 4 minutes are, where do we want to be, and really where are we now? What do we know about the state of clinical research in the UK? And then just sharing some thoughts that David and I've had in terms of our policy around commercial clinical research and where that fits. I mean, I think we know, it's often said, but we know that clinical research is good for patients, it's good for the health system, it's obviously essential for us when we're developing new medicines, and it's good for the economy. And when we then think about commercial clinical research, there are additional benefits, as well as being part of the development life cycle. There are economic benefits in terms of the jobs that commercial clinical research brings, and also specifics such as companies providing standard of care medicines within trials. For many of the years, the first part of the years that I've been working on clinical research, we didn't really have transparency into what was going on. So companies might say the UK is slow, but we didn't have transparency. And actually working through Brexit, and in particular COVID, The four nations and the departments across the four nations did a lot of work, including arm's length bodies like the MHRA and HRA, to really sort of think about how do we get those metrics and really try and understand the different bits along clinical research. So whilst these metrics aren't perfect, they're actually a huge step forward from where we were before. And the current metrics that are they're on the website, and I've got the link on the next couple of slides, break down into these indicators. So we have an indicator of recruiting first participant within 150 days. We've got approval, we've got opening to recruitment, and also then delivering recruitment to time and target. And what you see here is for each of these metrics, you get the latest month where the metric's available. So some of them are near real time, some of them are a bit delayed, as you'll see. The latest figure, and then also what the target is. And I think of these, you can see that the one that's in range is on target is the number of studies receiving combined review approval within 60 days. So that's at 99%, and so I've put that in green. And then the others are kind of need some work to be done. Ones that I've want to just focus on, so the proportion of commercial clinical trial studies recruiting the first participant within 50 days of applying for approval. Clearly, we want that target to be 95% or above. The latest figure for that is 78%, so that's something that needs to be improved. But then going on to the next couple of slides, these get quite interesting because they now start to break it down a bit more between commercial and non-commercial. And the bucket here of commercial collaborative essentially means where it's being funded by a commercial company but sponsored by perhaps an investigator in a hospital. And with this one, you see that you can start to see numbers of studies. So you see the skew towards non-commercial studies that David mentioned, and the differences in the target time. So for this one, a commercial contract study is they're at 79% as of March, whereas the non-commercial are at 83%. Going forward to the next slide, we then have a similar breakdown, so similar type of characteristics, but then this really shows the difference in the numbers of participants. So these were numbers of participants per month over the last 12 months up to January. And here you see non-commercial 76,000 a month compared to for those commercial contracts. So you're where the company is the sponsor. Then you've got, those are like 3,000 a month. Interesting here to see the pre-COVID baseline and just for comparison. And then I think the last slide I've got with this sort of breakdown is this one, which is the number of studies being added onto the NIHR clinical management system, clinical trial management system. And this was in February, and I thought this was quite interesting because actually the commercial studies together are similar numbers to non-commercial studies. So there's quite a few studies being added. So anyway, so it's great, actually, really great that we can see that level of detail because that wasn't necessarily there before. And certainly the fact that it's on a publicly available website and being updated is really helpful. But what are our recommendations beyond just going, okay, we need to do clinical trials and we'd like them to be faster and more of them than there are at the moment? I think where our reflections are sort of divide into two. One is sort of a set of specific actions, which I'll come on to in a minute, but the others are more what I'd group as understanding. So how do we collectively understand clinical research beyond those trial results? Call it understanding, call it mindset. I think the first thing is understanding that early phase trials are a point of vulnerability. And many, if not everyone on this audience will completely understand that because you're working in it every day. But actually, beyond this group, when we're talking at the wider ecosystem and possibly talking to government as well, that understanding isn't necessarily there, and clinical research is just seen as a sort of a big homogenous group of trials. But that early phase trials is at that point of vulnerability, transitioning from preclinical development to into phase one. So you've got the economic vulnerability for the company, but I think you've also got the vulnerability of decisions are being made, for example, endpoints or comparators, etc., that actually down the line will impact whether that compound is able to fulfill its potential for patients and economically. Second reflection, location of phase one matters. So enabling phase one studies in the UK increases the chances of then the subsequent studies being in the UK, but also understanding some trials may leave, some phase one studies may not happen in the UK for various reasons, but how do we get companies, encourage companies to come back for their subsequent development? And then the third thing is really understanding commercial clinical research as part of that national infrastructure. So we saw on the metrics, they talked about overall clinical research and then broke it down into commercial and non-commercial, but actually understanding that commercial isn't exactly the same as non-commercial research and needs to be recognised as a key part of this, not optional. And then in terms of some specific thoughts to finish up with, we've got, integrated, I think there are three things here, having an integrated operating model, certainly across clinical research. So how do you help companies to understand what's going on? For big companies with lots of heritage in clinical research, they probably know how to navigate the system, but for companies, either new companies to the UK or new companies within the UK, don't necessarily have that. Thinking about initiatives such as having a clinical development passport that builds on existing initiatives and actually gives certain companies help with regulatory and clinical system access. And then really following up on the metrics point, making sure that we are tracking and the delivery performance, the speed and that predictability. So thank you very much and looking forward to the discussion.
Thanks, Julie. I think some really interesting points came up there, and I could think of 101 questions in my head, and I'd encourage others to flag in so I probably won't see everybody on screen, so if you want to flag it into the chat box, I'll come back. But I guess I wanted to come back to David first of all, because you touched at the start really about the complexity of the funding landscape within this, how many players are involved. Then we heard about the need to be more streamlined and connected as an ecosystem from Matthew. Julie just pointed out the fact that this lack of a front door integrated system can be a real barrier and slow things down and put people off. I guess when you sort of put those things into context, do you think we have the right structures to fund life science innovation at all? We have a UKRI that's across multiple sectors. We have an industrial strategy across multiple sectors. Is it the fact that we keep trying to make a one-size-fits-all for things that aren't just natural bedfellows?
Yeah, I mean, perhaps so. I think it's tricky, right? So you either have the thing about having Innovate UK, UKRI, is that it allows government over a period of time to dial up and dial down different sectors. So that is the beauty of that structure. So you've got a government investment organisation that can do that. My concern is more. And they've got huge amounts of money. The 5-year settlement for UKI is 39 billion. They've been given very clear direction where they should put it. But the money they're putting into life sciences, the amount of money in there for commercial scale up is still relatively trivial. There was a comment in the comments box about getting £100 million from 10 wealthy investors. I mean, £100 million really isn't a lot of cash, right? Is the reality for quite a lot of these UK companies. You need about £15 million to get a drug through the basic into clinic, and so I think UKRI's problem is it's making assumptions about what's being funded without a really clear understanding of the environment. The first thing I would do if I was trying to work out where the gaps were, the first thing I would do as a minister is commission a review of the UK funding environment. It's the absolute first thing I would do. And I would include the charity sector, the universities, I would do the whole lot so that we really understand where the money's actually going to. There's one of these papers suggested that 87% of the 2 billion almost that charities put into research in the UK go to universities. Now, I suspect if you start scratching the surface, you'll discover quite a lot of money is going to universities relative to companies. But I think until we know, we can't have that strategic conversation.
Yeah, I think that's fair really on that. Then both then for Matthew and for Shuli, I guess, I was struck by your comment, Matthew, that the life science companies are an extension of the universities in discovery. So it's all one sort of
It
equilibrium,
is.
And I think it raised a question for me, and I guess the same thing then occurred to me when Shuli, you talked about the clinical trial environment and whether they're non-commercial, commercial, the balance was strategic. Matthew, from your side, do we spin out companies and drugs too early from universities? Do we have sort of too many startups with too early projects, and we should incubate them for longer? And I guess same sort of question, but on the clinical side then, Shuli, like how do you set the priorities of what is clinically undertaken? So Matthew, perhaps your thoughts on that translational bit.
So I think that we shouldn't keep them longer in universities. It's better to get them out into the biotech sphere where people have a much more commercial focus. Academics can do phenomenal work, but they can focus on academic interest without focusing on getting to value at the end of the day. So I think we do have to get companies out into biotech quickly so they can be worked on by drug discovery professionals that can take them to the next value inflection point. Maybe there needs to be more smoothing over for the interface between universities and biotech companies. I think there still is not a great understanding amongst some academics about what can be done and what the biotech companies are trying to do. So I think some way of some forum for making sure that biotech founders understand what the biotech companies are going to do with their babies. I think that's important because I think that some founders can get disturbed by what happens when biotechs come in and take a more commercial bent.
Okay. And Shuli?
Yeah, and I think sort of adding a sort of from the clinical research, I think this is a question that's been had before is around prioritization of clinical research. How do you decide which trials to prioritize? And the sort of clearest example we had of that was actually COVID, where in COVID, essentially trials to do with vaccines or therapeutics for COVID were prioritized and other trials were deprioritized, which at the time, I think that was understood and talked through. But actually, even within that, with hindsight, I think there's, people look back and say there were a lot of trials that were run by, clinical trials in COVID, run by academics, which were underpowered and didn't, they just created extra work and extra noise, but they were underpowered to answer the question of could you repurpose this therapeutic in COVID, for example. So I think, and that was happening around the world. And I think that kind of, if you're going to do a trial, make it meaningful is probably the kind of the key thing. And what is meaningful? Is it because this is a regulatory, part of your regulatory pathway to a new molecule? Yes. Is it a meaningful trial in terms of telling you something about real world functioning of the medicine, which might lead to a new indication or part of your safety monitoring or whatever? Yes. But I think then there's other trials. How do we have that conversation about prioritizing which sorts of trials? And I know that conversation's been one that's been sort of flagged in the past as how could you do it, but it's actually very difficult to then, balance all the different interests from, different academics, different therapy areas, different companies at different things. But it's back to, I think, David's point about the choices. What are the choices you make?
I mean, I think that's a really important point, Julie, and I think so. Morally and ethically, what do I think about clinical trials? I think if you're going to do research and discover stuff that you can't then get to patients, if you don't have a roadmap for how that becomes a treatment of some type at some stage in the future, I think it's really tricky to justify public spending on those kind of research. And I wonder, we've recently seen NICE and the MHRA come together to try and work together more to get medicines through the system. I don't think it's nearly integrated enough, because I think a really fundamental question that we should be asking at the point of an application for a trial is how does this take us to treatment for patients? How does this take us to an intervention? And if it doesn't, do we do it at all? We're seeing the NHS repurposing group was set up attempting to repurpose medicines, spent a lot of money and then closed down again because they realized they couldn't take drugs through the regulatory process. So, what was the point of all of that spending? What was the point of putting patients into trials when you're not going to create a medicine? And I think we could task the MHRA and NICE with being more collaborative and braver.
Just be
Tony,
purposeful,
I want so Shirley talked about prioritization in clinical trials. There's also, Innovate UK is prioritizing drug discovery programs, and maybe that's the best thing to do to get drug discovery projects forward into, because as David pointed out, it takes 15 million to get a candidate, 25 million to get to an IND. So maybe that's the right thing for Innovate UK to do, to be less bitty and fund more. Fund less horses for longer. But there is a worry about that, and that is that yes, we still don't know which drugs are going to work. Our success rate, going into the clinic is less than 10%. So on each of the 10 horses, we don't know which of those 10 horses is going to ultimately bring back money. So this is something that the sector and we, as a drug in the drug discovery community, I realise there's people in the development community here as well, but in the drug discovery community, we need to think about how can we maximise those chances of success. And the more we can de-risk our programmes, the more we're going to get funding from investors, from Innovate UK and the like. So yes, maybe we do have to choose fewer horses, but the problem is that drug discovery has been very spread out and bitty and lots of different bits and pieces, and one of them makes it through. So this is a challenge that we have.
Like you remind me of something. It was a chap. He was with Genzyme for quite a while, but straight from the business side rather than from the science side. And I was saying, like, this difficulty of picking winners early on. And he always maintained his philosophy was the fact that you back winners, you don't pick them. Because if you don't back anything big enough, then you won't have any winners at all, irrespective of whether they could have won. And I think it sort of relates to your sort of hypothesis there, Matthew, I think in that sense. I mean, it's kind of interesting.
If you back a loser, Tony, though, if you back a loser, that adds up to the overall drug cost for every, at the end
absolutely.
of the day.
I guess it's one of those, how far do you have to back them and how many can you seriously back, I guess, is where it comes down to get the numbers game to add up. But
I don't know if that's true of government funding, though. I mean, venture funding, yes, the more losers you've got, the more you expect for a return on investment. Big pharma, yes, the more phase 3 failures you've got, the more of a challenge you've got on your share price. But I think public funding can back losers without necessarily, the government's not looking for an ROI on any individual medicine.
Yeah, good point. There's interesting comments in the chat box about sort of more evergreen structures and capital recycling models, the likes of Flagship, OSE, and VIB is an interesting institution and the way it integrates over in Belgium. I mean, Simon Leonard, you sort of flagged this up, as had someone Biggs, I think, had been to VIB. I don't know whether that's a Dr. Biggs, Professor Biggs, or other. I'm sorry. But Simon, I don't know if you want to expand on that a bit. And Dr. Biggs, if you'd like to unmute and come on screen, then I'll come to you after Simon on that one, because I think it's an interesting concept.
Yeah, I mean, it goes back to, I assume you can all hear me. It goes back to some of the conversations we've had before about, ultimately what is the solution going to be to all of this? And I think it was, Matthew made the great example. We have everything in the UK. I mean, we have everything we need. We have all of the moving parts. We actually do have, effectively all of the pieces. We just need to put them together in a way that has that overall operating system operator or national owner, actually, that David talked about. And there are good examples. And so for me, it is that a concept of how do you link the funding to the ownership and actually the leadership by the people who actually know what they're doing. And I do discount the government in that, to be honest. It is the industry that actually knows best, how to manage the industry, I would say. So, and the brilliant examples are Oxford Scientific Enterprise, actually, which does have this independent evergreen fund with obviously with university IP exclusivity, but they realize, exit profits in a way that is automatically recycled back to fund, which, whatever stage is currently choked, whether that's seed or ultimately growth stroke scale. Flagship Pioneering, I mean, that's a vertically integrated model, institutional venture creation fund. And they have their own internal categorization that allows shifting funds from raw projects, raw prototypes to late stage clinical assets, depending on market conditions, depending on needs, depending on where they are. So that's another model. The VIB is a really interesting one because that is a sovereign backed tech transfer, which, with equity and royalty recycling. And that is an example of what the country, the national, it's UK, it's government funded. So it's a brilliant example and really, really interesting. And they have that overall sort of commercial licensing revenue from mature assets that directly funds early stage basic research grants. And then there's the Novo Nordisk Foundation in Denmark. And I read up on this one. This one's really interesting as well, because that's more evergreen focused, mega scale foundation that has again the sort of multiple investment arms, as I understood it, and is again balancing funding from incubation through to late stage. So it can be done. That's the point. And actually, I think the VIB example is a really brilliant one of what the country actually, or the government of the country actually does and could be doing. So, and for me, it's the answer to just linking the ownership of the people who know what they're doing to the funding that actually gives us the ability to deliver and being able to move it, as David said.
Listen, and sorry, I do apologise, Dr. Biggs.
It's all right, Tony. I'd like to give me a doctorship as well. I'm not a doctor, but I just wanted to add a point. And I think after visiting Ghent last year, I think all of the points that were raised by Simon are incredibly valid, but also there's a real sense of positivity and enthusiasm around working within that sort of ecosystem and that structure. And that obviously promotes and builds innovation and allows you to, sort of your young scientists to sort of push forward and develop those molecules. Whereas in the UK, I'm not saying it's isolated to science. There is certainly a level of sort of downtroddenness when I go to conferences or trade shows around the UK about the state of our ecosystem. And I think, anything that we can do to try and change that and try and build upon the examples that we see within our European counterparts would certainly be positive for the ecosystem as a whole.
Indeed, I think the can-do attitude goes a long way to bringing others with your vision at times, I think. I'm conscious we're almost up to time and these things I never feel long enough, but if people are happy, we'll keep reconvening and pick on different elements, even looking in the chat box about what do we learn about from other ecosystems, what do we learn from other industries as well, in terms of complexity and how to develop that as an ecosystem. And also then what could incentivize UK biotechs to be working more with UK CROs. So I think all topics I'd like to come back to if people are happy with that. But I think that sense of positivity and can do on what's next, I think leads us on nicely, because we started this webinar last month and the dinner last week, and this webinar really from Natasha Robbins talking to us about the level of redundancy we were seeing and the challenges individuals. It's a very personal impact. So Natasha, I wonder whether you wanted to share any thoughts around what you've heard today, but generally about what can we be doing as impacted people or as people trying to support those between jobs and business cards, and how that can align.
Yeah, I think, yeah, I mean, I'm speaking to people daily who are finding the market still incredibly tough. There are still redundancies happening. And I think it's just about acknowledging that, yeah, the market is tough for them right now. I've had discussions with a lot of them just to ask from their point of view, what would they like? What do they want to see more of? But it still boils down to, I think a lot of it costs money to support them potentially. I think there's been a lot of talk about having, maybe an accelerator program if somebody has been out of work for more than 12 months or 18 months. Is there a program that they could join that could help accelerate them back into work? Might not necessarily be a government funded program, but could it be programs that are initiated by your, companies like GSK, AZ, big CROs that are willing to help these people on a program to maybe help give them additional skills, place them back into the marketplace when they have been out of work for X amount of times. So, yeah, I think in terms of supporting people, just reaching out to people, if you do get messages from people, I think asking for your input or help or advice, have a chat with them, give them, it's just sometimes it's just that free advice and time that they need to try and navigate a market, especially now there's a lot of people that want to maybe transition. I'm speaking to a lot of early stage scientists that are looking at the clinical market and thinking, oh, maybe this is something that I need to learn or what I need to look at, but they just don't know, they don't know where to start. They feel that they haven't got the transferable skills potentially. So what I'm telling them to do is to maybe speak to people that have made that transition, talk to them about what worked for them, and use that as a starting point.
Yeah, I think it was odd. I was on a call yesterday, not to do with life sciences as such, but it was the regional authority skills board talking about different programs to support entry level, and entry level for them was kind of 16 to 19 years old.
Yeah.
And they had these skills boot camps, which is just to get people thinking about what industries they could be in, what skills they got, what they could acquire. And then I asked the question about, well, what is there for people who have been in work, their industry's changing. If they're a great data scientist in one industry, they could be a great data scientist in another, but they don't know the pathways to that or to actually transition within their own changing industry, perhaps. I said, no, what support was there? And then there was this kind of uncomfortable tumbleweed moment amongst the discussion because there was nothing.
Yeah.
And I just think, if they talk a lot about lifelong learning, but actually it doesn't come into practice. And I think we need to support that better.
I think I spoke to somebody today who told me about Novartis have an accelerator program for different, either entry level or it could be like a career gap. But I think the requirement for that was 2 years. And 2 years is a very long time to be out of work. And I think people don't have 2 years. So I think, if somebody has been out of work 12 months, is there anything big organizations can do to create programs that can help support them back into the workplace within science, so they're still using their technical skills rather than losing these people to different industries and potentially different countries?
I think that's the thing, you lose them from the industry, or indeed they move overseas and compete back against our own economy when we had the expertise here all along if we found the mechanism. So I think there are so many things we could talk about. If people are happy, we'll come back for another one of these webinars to touch base on any number of topics that we could keep going on. And I'm seeing some nods on the screen, which is always encouraging. But I'd like to thank our speakers for today, as well as Hazel Jones and Dave Graham, who were one of that passionate group that came forward initially to say we need to do something about this. This One Nucleus is pleasure, really, in a sense, to be able to support that passion coming to the screen and to keep the discussion live and look for some solutions that we can help people or companies, and ideally both. and ultimately we all want to help patients. So thanks everyone for your time today and all the comments. We'll capture everything we can, and we'll come back with another follow-up if people are happy with the series. So thanks everyone. Thanks very much.
Thanks for arranging, Tony. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.